Carol, first, you mentioned that in New York, usually the typology you don't have multiple dwellings per floor on these very high-rise buildings. Do you see that? Are there any projects currently like that or proposed, or do you think that's something that might change in the future? Is that just not feasible in New York?
Is this on? Well, it's definitely feasible. I just want to make the distinction between the ultra-luxury, super slender as a developer strategy and a very mass market solution, as it were, mass public housing solution, which has a completely different strategy for economy, but then necessity of different floor plans, different massing, different FAR constraints. So I think I was simply just asking for a more specific and critical way of thinking about the distinguishing the typology, not just thinking that all tall buildings are super tall so that they're the same. They're very different profit motives, and of course in housing, the economy motive is paramount for the multiplicity of units.
Ada, are most of the units on the social housing rentals or their sales? Is it something very important for the people of Hong Kong of owning a home, or are they okay with renting a home? How do Hong Kong population deal with that distinction?
First of all, I think we are building public rental housing as the primary product that we are producing. So, and also, we are also building flats for sale, subsidized flats for sale, to a smaller scale and extent. So right now we have a stock for about 30% population for Hong Kong, which is public rental housing, and around 15% are subsidized sale flats. So altogether, you can say that about 45% people living in the subsidized flats, some are for sale, some are for rental. But primarily these are for rental.
And Mr. Choi, finally, what places should we definitely avoid during a typhoon so we don't have to see you tomorrow?
Okay, stay indoor. Is there an optimum height for the social housing that you will build up to, and a height at which it just doesn't work in your economic terms?
The most economic or optimal building height will be about 40 domestic stories above ground. 40 stories building do not require a refuge floor in between them. About 40 stories, we need one refuge floor for every 25 stories. So the next economical height will be 50 stories with one rescue floor, and the next one will be 75 stories with 2 rescue floors. We haven't ventured into that kind of height. The tallest one we have for public housing or social housing, as you said, is around 46 stories or thereabouts, with one rescue floor. And we'll try to make the best use of all the available land.
Question for Ada, and I very much appreciate the efforts that you take to create a high quality of life for the people that live in the buildings that you do. One of the things that you didn't talk about was access to natural light and sky views from the units themselves. Is that something that you give some guidance on in terms of separation distances, for example, from principal windows? Do you use your BIM modeling, for example, to test that criteria?
Thanks for the question. First, we have to comply with the building regulations which govern adequate lighting and ventilation. So this is a fundamental. And next, we conduct microclimate studies for the indoor environment for each flat or each module, also for the communal areas and the public areas as well. So something that I haven't mentioned about the units themselves, we will provide natural ventilation and cross ventilation where possible. So there would be windows on at least one facade or primarily on 2 facades of a flat with a re-entrance. So we'll make sure that what we design will be adequately ventilated and with good natural ventilation and cross ventilation.
With regard to the social housing, Obviously, in many Western contexts, in America or in Europe, there has been a lot of problems with high-rise social housing. What do you think contributes to Hong Kong's relative success in this area and the relative lack of social problems that we would have seen in Britain or in perhaps in America?
I think it's a very good question. I think people are accustomed to living in high-rise buildings in Hong Kong, rich or less affordable families. For high-rise living, one important point is that they can gain easy access to a lot of facilities, both welfare facilities, retail facilities, or transport facilities at the doorsteps, downstairs. So this is one point is very important for comprehensive developments, and also we need good planning so that people will not feel deprived and they can live with pride in the social housing or public housing. They won't feel kind of inferior to anyone. So this is something which we have to build a harmonious society. And we have the estate management advisory committees for all the estates. And there will be one representative from every block, every building, who can air their views and voices for any improvement works that they see fit for their property.
Yeah. What's the minimum space per person, dwelling units? Like, I think in Tokyo is 1 tatami per person.
Oh.
And for transition homes, after disasters, 3.5 square meters per person. For this public housing, what's the minimum?
I think a very good question. I think I've mentioned it that for the allocation standard, it is 7 square meters per person of internal floor space, internal floor area. And that is the allocation standard. But the average living area for all the tenants right now is around 13 square meters per person. So it's not too bad for the average living space. And I think right now we have some other problem because people do not see public housing as a welfare. They see it as their right.
Yeah.
And so we have a long queue of families and also single persons who are university students queuing up for public housing. And that's why it seems like something which is insatiable and it's in demand but in short supply. So I've been working very hard to build faster and build more. And the living space I've mentioned for the indoor space, it is designed to enable a flexible use of internal floor space for the interior designers to use their ingenuity to let people having different habitable spaces. Now, I would say that for internal space, even for smallest flats, we have a 4-meter module in terms of length that can be used as 2 living zones of each 2 meter by 2.5 meter, that kind of space. They can have the living area and also the sleeping area. And I think for the outdoor space I've mentioned, we have at least 1 square meter per person of open space. And I think we have around 30% green spaces for large sites and 20% green spaces for smaller sites that can enable them to have a very comfortable outdoor living room for everyone. They can go there, mingle, chat, and socialize with people of all ages and abilities.
Yeah, amazing. You know, it's surprising. I was doing some calculations. If the rest of the world used the density of Hong Kong, the 7 billion will all fit in the state of Texas. And yet you have a very high human development index and sustainable city. Thank you.
Mr. Choi, I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts were regarding the use of elevators for evacuation, particularly during fire.
Yes, if in a case of fire, actually the elevators will be used by the firemen. The firemen will use the fireman lift with a fireman's lift lobby, protected lobby, link up to the fireman's lift. But it is only the means of access, but it is not the means of escape for the residents. For the residents, the fireman will lead them to the escape routing using the staircase to go down, or going to the refuge floor, or going down to the ground. So actually, the elevators, in the case of fire, will not be used by the residents, but only used by the firemen. in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Caroline was advocating a set of new data with comparison of height and floor areas. I will be advocating for a set of data with facade and floor area ratio. Reason being, just looking at the plans that Ada's been showing of all the Hong Kong social housing, I think from an outsider's point of view, one would notice that it is extremely complicated. It seems like it has a very, very high facade ratio area. And I think, this is something that you would not see in social housings or any housings in Europe or in North America. I'm just wondering, understand the fact that the housing authority is trying to promote cross ventilation. I'm just speculating that whether this is a luxury, or perhaps you can just do with normal single aspect ventilation instead of cross ventilation. I'm just thinking if you reduce the facade ratio and thereby having a much simpler floor plate, you might be able to save a lot of money and use that money on communal facilities instead. I'm not sure whether it is to do with the typical Hong Kong living or belief that every single room has to have a window.
Thanks for this question. I think it is our norm that will provide natural lighting and ventilation to all the living spaces, as well as kitchens and bathrooms for public housing. For healthy living, that's very important. Beware about the spread of SARS, for instance, in the year 2003, and that prompts us to develop a common W-trap system to prevent the spread of disease from one floor to another. We're very mindful of a healthy living environment, so natural ventilation and lighting is very important to all the living areas as well as the kitchen and bathrooms. That's why we may have slightly larger external wall to floor ratio, but we will not sacrifice it for healthy living.